I had been dreaming of owning farmland since I was 12 years old, growing up in the suburbs of Chicago. My father worked in finance, my mother was a teacher, and nobody in my family had ever touched soil with the intention of growing food. But something deep inside me called to the earth, to the rhythm of seasons, to the ancient dance between seed and harvest. When I finally saved enough money at 35 to buy 40 acres of farmland in rural Iowa, I thought I was finally home. The property had been neglected for years, with fields overgrown with weeds and a farmhouse that needed more repair than I initially realized. But I saw potential where others saw problems. The local farming community in Millfield Township was tight-knit, comprised of families who had been working the same land for generations. The Hendersons had been farming their 800 acres since 1892. The Morrison family controlled over 1,000 acres of prime corn and soybean land. The Kowalskis ran a successful dairy operation that had expanded steadily for 60 years. I introduced myself at the local feed store on my first week, eager to build relationships and learn from experienced neighbors. The reception was polite but cool. I could feel their skeptical glances as I asked basic questions about soil pH, seed varieties, and optimal planting times. "You picked a challenging piece of land there," old Bill Henderson told me, stroking his gray beard. "That soil hasn't been properly farmed in over a decade. Gonna take more than city money to make it productive." I smiled and thanked him for the advice, but I could sense the underlying message. To them, I was just another suburban dreamer who would give up after one difficult season. They had seen my type before. People with romantic notions about farming who lasted until their first real challenge. But they didn't know about the research I had been doing for years, the agricultural courses I had taken online, or the burning determination that had brought me here. My first month on the farm was a crash course in rural reality. The 40 acres were divided into several fields, each with its own unique challenges. The north field had drainage issues. The south field had compacted soil from years of heavy machinery, and the east field had a slight slope that would require careful management to prevent erosion. I spent my days walking every inch of my property, taking soil samples, measuring moisture levels, and documenting the existing vegetation. My neighbors watched from their tractors as I crouched in fields with my pH meter and notebook, methodically cataloging everything I found. "Look at him playing scientist," I overheard Jake Morrison tell his son as they drove past on their massive combine harvester. "Farming ain't about lab work. It's about understanding the land with your hands, not gadgets." The comment stung because it contained a grain of truth. I was approaching farming like an engineer approaches a problem, with data, research, and systematic analysis. But I was also learning that farming required intuition, experience, and a deep connection to natural rhythms that couldn't be quantified. At the weekly coffee gathering at Miller's Diner, the local farmers would discuss weather patterns, crop prices, and equipment maintenance. I joined these informal meetings, hoping to learn and contribute to the conversation. But I quickly realized that my presence created an awkward dynamic. "How's that 40 acres treating you?" Tom Kowalski asked with barely concealed amusement. "Figured out what you're gonna plant yet?" "I'm thinking about trying some specialty crops," I replied carefully. "Maybe some heirloom varieties that could command premium prices." The table fell silent for a moment before Bill Henderson chuckled. "Specialty crops, huh? Son, this is Iowa. We grow corn and soybeans because that's what grows here. That's what makes money. You can't reinvent agriculture because you read some articles on the internet." I nodded politely, but inside I was taking notes. Their dismissiveness was teaching me as much about this community as their farming advice. Spring planting season arrived with its typical chaos of timing, weather concerns, and equipment breakdowns. I had spent the winter months preparing my soil, purchasing a modest collection of used farming equipment, and finalizing my crop selection. After extensive research, I had decided to plant a diverse mix that went against conventional wisdom in the area. Instead of the traditional corn and soybean rotation, I planned to grow organic vegetables, heirloom grains, and specialty crops for direct-to-consumer sales. My strategy was to focus on quality over quantity, targeting urban markets hungry for locally grown organic produce. The local farmers watched my preparations with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. When they saw me unloading organic seeds and setting up a small greenhouse for starting seedlings, the whispers started. "City boy thinks he's gonna get rich growing fancy vegetables," I heard someone say at the feed store. The breaking point came during a particularly wet April, when everyone was anxious about getting crops in the ground. I was working late one evening, transplanting tomato seedlings in my greenhouse, when Jake Morrison and his son pulled up in their pickup truck. "We need to talk," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being respected in the community. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked out to meet them. Jake was a large man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you," Jake said. "You seem like a decent enough guy, but you're not a real farmer. Real farmers understand this land, respect the traditions that made this community what it is." His son nodded in agreement. "You're playing dress up with 40 acres while we're feeding America with thousands of acres of actual crops. What you're doing isn't farming," Jake continued. "It's gardening on a slightly larger scale. When the weather turns against you, when the markets shift, when reality hits, you'll be gone, just like the others before you." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but I kept my voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm committed to making this work." Jake shook his head. "We'll see about that." After the confrontation with Jake Morrison, I could have backed down, could have switched to conventional crops and tried to fit in with the established farming community. Instead, I doubled down on my original plan. Their dismissal had ignited something deeper than stubbornness. It had awakened a determination to prove that innovation and traditional farming could coexist. I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity. I studied soil biology, learned about beneficial insects, and experimented with companion planting techniques that maximized the productivity of my small acreage. While my neighbors planted vast monocultures of corn and soybeans, I created a complex ecosystem of interconnected crops. My 40 acres became a patchwork of different plants. I grew specialty tomatoes, unique varieties of lettuce, heritage beans, and unusual grains that restaurants in Des Moines and Iowa City were eager to purchase. I also planted pollinator strips and maintained hedgerows that provided habitat for beneficial insects. The other farmers drove past my fields with obvious confusion. Where they saw chaos, I saw carefully planned diversity. Where they saw inefficiency, I saw resilience and sustainability. "He's got weeds growing right next to his crops," Bill Henderson told anyone who would listen. "That's not farming. That's just giving up on proper land management." But I wasn't growing weeds. I was growing carefully selected companion plants that improved soil health, attracted beneficial insects, and actually increased the productivity of my main crops. The nasturtiums I planted near my tomatoes weren't decorative. They repelled harmful insects while attracting pollinators. By midsummer, my experiment was showing promising results. My plants were healthier and more productive than I had dared to hope. The diverse ecosystem I had created was proving remarkably resilient to the pests and weather challenges that typically plagued monoculture farms. Local restaurant owners started visiting my farm directly, impressed by the quality and variety of produce I could offer. Word began spreading about the experimental farm that was producing exceptional ingredients for high-end kitchens. But I knew the real test would come at harvest time. As summer progressed, my farm began attracting attention beyond the local community. Agricultural extension agents started visiting, curious about my integrated pest management techniques and soil improvement methods. A photographer from the State University's Agriculture Department came to document my diverse cropping system. My direct-to-consumer sales were exceeding projections. The farmers market in Des Moines had a waiting list of customers wanting to purchase my heirloom tomatoes and specialty greens. Restaurants were calling weeks in advance to reserve portions of my harvest. But the local farming community remained skeptical. At Miller's Diner, conversations would pause when I entered, resuming in hushed tones after I found a seat. I had become the subject of ongoing debate. Was I a visionary pioneer or a foolish outsider who would inevitably fail? Sure, he's selling some fancy vegetables to city folks, Tom Kowalski admitted during one coffee session. But farming isn't about boutique crops. It's about feeding people with reliable, affordable food. When push comes to shove, corn and soybeans feed the world. I understood their perspective. They were feeding America with efficient, large-scale agriculture that had fed billions of people. My 40 acres of diverse crops couldn't compete with their thousands of acres in terms of total caloric production. But I was proving something different, that small-scale, intensive agriculture could be both environmentally sustainable and economically viable. My cost per acre was higher, but my revenue per acre was dramatically exceeding theirs. The tension came to a head during the county's annual Agriculture Day celebration. Each farm was invited to set up a display showcasing their operation. The established farmers displayed samples of their corn and soybeans, along with charts showing their impressive yields per acre. I brought samples of my diverse harvest, over 30 different varieties of vegetables, grains, and herbs. My display looked like a farmer's market compared to their industrial agriculture exhibits. "That's very pretty," Jake Morrison's wife said, examining my heirloom tomatoes. "But how many people can you feed with 40 acres of boutique crops?" "More than you might think," I replied, producing my financial records showing revenue per acre that surprised even me. Late July brought a discovery that would change everything. While walking through my fields one evening, checking on my crops and enjoying the peaceful transition from day to night, I noticed something unusual in my heritage grain section. The ancient wheat variety I'd been experimenting with, emmer wheat, which had been grown by early civilizations but largely abandoned by modern agriculture, was showing remarkable characteristics. The plants were not only thriving in Iowa's climate, but producing yields that seemed impossible for this supposedly low-productivity ancient grain. More importantly, I noticed that the emmer wheat was having a positive effect on the soil and the surrounding crops. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria around its roots seemed more active than normal, and the neighboring vegetables were showing enhanced growth. I took soil samples around the wheat and had them analyzed at Iowa State University's agricultural laboratory. The results were startling. The emmer wheat was not only producing exceptional yields, but was actually improving soil fertility in ways that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture. Dr. Sarah Chen, a soil scientist at the university, called me personally to discuss the results. "These numbers are extraordinary," she said. "The biological activity in your soil is off the charts. What are you doing differently?" I explained my integrated approach: the companion planting, the beneficial insect habitats, the diverse crop rotations, and the minimal use of external inputs. Dr. Chen requested permission to bring a research team to study my farming methods. "This could be groundbreaking," she told me. "You might have stumbled onto something that could change how we think about sustainable agriculture." Word of the university's interest began spreading through the agricultural community. Suddenly, my farming methods were being discussed not as quaint experiments, but as potentially significant innovations. But I knew that for the local farmers to take me seriously, I needed to demonstrate success in terms they understood: total productivity and profitability. The upcoming harvest would be my moment to prove that my approach wasn't just sustainable and interesting, but also practical and profitable. I began calculating projected yields from all my crops and realized that my total productivity per acre might exceed what anyone expected from such a diverse operation. August brought the intense preparation period before harvest season. While my neighbors focused on maintaining their massive combines and planning the logistics of harvesting thousands of acres, I prepared for a more complex but potentially more rewarding harvest. My 40 acres contained over 50 different crops at various stages of maturity. Some vegetables were already being harvested continuously throughout the summer, while others were approaching their peak. The heritage grains would be ready in September, and my specialty seed crops were developing beautifully. I had pre-sold most of my harvest to restaurants, specialty food stores, and direct customers willing to pay premium prices for quality and uniqueness. but I had also been secretly calculating total yields to compare my productivity with the conventional farms surrounding me. Dr. Chen and her research team from Iowa State had been monitoring my fields throughout the summer, documenting everything from soil biology to pest populations to plant health metrics. Their preliminary findings suggested that my integrated approach was producing results that challenged conventional agricultural wisdom. Your yields per acre are approaching levels we typically see only in highly intensive greenhouse operations, Dr. Chen told me. But you're doing it outdoors, with minimal external inputs, and actually improving the soil in the process. The local farming community was beginning to pay attention. Equipment dealers who had initially ignored my small operation started stopping by to see what I was doing. Seed companies sent representatives to observe my heritage varieties. But Jake Morrison and his core group of established farmers remained skeptical. "University professors can say whatever they want," Jake told anyone who would listen. "But at the end of the day, farming is about putting food on America's table, not impressing academics with fancy experiments." I understood his position, but I also knew that my harvest would speak louder than any research study or academic endorsement. The numbers would tell the story. Total productivity, total revenue, and total profit per acre. As September approached, I fine-tuned my harvest logistics. Unlike my neighbors who could harvest their fields with massive equipment in a matter of days, my harvest would require weeks of careful, selective picking and processing. But I was confident that the results would justify the effort. September arrived with perfect weather for harvesting. Clear skies, cool mornings, and warm afternoons created ideal conditions for bringing in crops. Across the township, massive combines began moving through fields of corn and soybeans, efficiently processing thousands of acres into grain that would feed livestock and provide ingredients for processed foods. My harvest was dramatically different. I started each day at dawn, walking through my fields to assess which crops were at peak ripeness. My heirloom tomatoes required individual selection, choosing only fruits at perfect maturity for premium markets. The specialty greens needed to be harvested at precise moments to maintain their quality and shelf life. But the most exciting moment came when I began harvesting my heritage grains. The Emma wheat that had shown such promising characteristics throughout the summer exceeded all expectations. The yields were not just good for an ancient grain variety. They were exceptional by any standard. I hand-harvested several test plots and calculated the yields carefully. The numbers were remarkable. My Emma wheat was producing over 60 bushels per acre, compared to the 20 to 30 bushels typically expected from this variety. More importantly, the grain quality was exceptional, with protein content and nutritional density that far exceeded modern wheat varieties. Dr. Chen and her team were present for the grain harvest, documenting everything and taking samples for comprehensive analysis. "These results could revolutionize our understanding of sustainable grain production," she told me. "You're proving that ancient varieties can be both productive and environmentally beneficial." But the most satisfying moment came when I calculated the total productivity of my diverse operation. By the end of September, my 40 acres had produced revenues that exceeded $150,000, more than $3,150 per acre. This compared to the typical $500 to $800 per acre that conventional corn and soybean operations generated. Even more importantly, my profit margins were extraordinary because my input costs were so low. The integrated ecosystem I had created required minimal fertilizers, pesticides, or other external inputs. News of my harvest results began spreading through the agricultural community, creating ripples of discussion and debate. Chapter 9: The Reckoning. October brought the annual Harvest Festival, where the farming community traditionally gathered to celebrate another successful growing season. This year, however, the festival had an undercurrent of tension as word of my exceptional harvest results spread throughout the region. I arrived at the festival grounds with a display that told the story of my season in numbers that couldn't be disputed. Revenue per acre, $3,750. Profit margins, over 70%. Soil health improvements, documented by university research. customer satisfaction, 100% of my produce pre-sold for the following year. The established farmers examined my display with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to grudging respect. The numbers were undeniable, but they challenged fundamental assumptions about efficient agriculture. "Those are impressive numbers," Bill Henderson admitted, studying my harvest documentation. "But can you scale it up? Can you feed America with 40-acre farms growing specialty crops?" It was a fair question, and I had prepared for it. "I'm not trying to replace large-scale agriculture," I replied, "but I am proving that diversified, sustainable farming can be both environmentally beneficial and economically viable. There's room for both approaches." Jake Morrison approached my display with his characteristic skepticism, but I could see that the documented results had shaken his confidence in his dismissive attitude. "These numbers," he said, pointing at my revenue calculations, "are they accurate?" "Completely verifiable," I replied. "Dr. Chen's research team documented everything. The university has all the data." Jake studied the information for several minutes before speaking again. "I still say what you're doing isn't real farming. It's boutique agriculture for wealthy consumers, but..." He paused, clearly struggling with his next words. "I have to admit, you proved me wrong about your commitment and your ability to make it work." It wasn't a complete concession, but it was acknowledgement that my approach had succeeded beyond what anyone had predicted. The festival continued around us, but I could sense that something had changed in the community's perception of me and my farming methods. Chapter 10. Recognition and Respect. Following the Harvest Festival, my farming operation gained recognition that extended far beyond Millfield Township. Agricultural magazines requested interviews, university researchers wanted to study my methods, and other beginning farmers sought advice on implementing similar approaches. The Iowa Department of Agriculture invited me to speak at their annual Sustainable Agriculture Conference. The presentation drew standing-room-only crowds as I shared the story of my first year farming and the results that had surprised even me. The key wasn't just diversity, I explained to the audience. It was creating a system where each component supported the others. The flowers I grew weren't just pretty. They attracted beneficial insects that controlled pests throughout the farm. The heritage grains didn't just produce food. They improved soil biology for all my crops. Dr. Chen published the first academic paper about my farming methods in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture. The research documented not just my exceptional yields, but the environmental benefits of my integrated approach. The paper generated significant interest in the scientific community and led to additional research funding to study similar methods. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from unexpected sources within my own community. Tom Kowalski stopped by my farm one afternoon in November, ostensibly to look at some equipment I was selling, but really to ask questions about my soil management techniques. "My yields have been declining gradually over the past few years," he admitted reluctantly. "The extension agent says it's normal, but I'm wondering if there might be something to this soil biology stuff you're doing." We spent 2 hours walking through my fields, discussing cover crops, beneficial bacteria, and integrated pest management. Tom took notes and asked thoughtful questions about adapting some of my techniques to his larger-scale operation. Similar conversations began happening with other farmers in the community. They weren't ready to abandon their established methods entirely, but they were curious about incorporating elements of my approach into their operations. The dynamic in Miller's Diner had shifted. Instead of skeptical whispers, conversations now included genuine questions about my methods and respectful discussion of different farming philosophies. I had found my place in the community, not by conforming to their expectations, but by proving that innovation and tradition could coexist. Chapter 11. Winter Planning. Winter provided time for reflection and planning. As snow covered my fields, I spent long evenings in my farmhouse, analyzing the data from my first growing season and planning improvements for the following year. The financial success was gratifying, but the environmental improvements were equally important. My soil health had improved dramatically in just one season. The biological activity that Dr. Chen's team had documented was creating a foundation for even better results in future years. I received calls from farmers across the Midwest who had heard about my methods and wanted to visit during the off-season. My farmhouse became an informal classroom where I shared everything I had learned about integrating diverse crops, managing beneficial insects, and building soil biology. Jake Morrison surprised me by calling in January to discuss a potential collaboration. "Look," he said, his voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before. "I've been farming the same way for 30 years, and the results keep getting more marginal. What you did last year, maybe there's something I can learn." We met at his farm on a cold February morning. Jake had 800 acres, but he was interested in experimenting with my methods on a small section of his land. "I'm not ready to change everything," he said, "but I'm willing to try something different on 40 acres. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The same 40 acres that he had dismissed as too small to be real farming was now the model for his experimental plot. "You proved something important last year," Jake admitted as we walked across his snow-covered fields. "Size isn't everything in farming. Sometimes innovation matters more than tradition." I helped Jake design an integrated system for his experimental plot, adapting my methods to work with his existing equipment and infrastructure. We planned cover crops, beneficial insect habitats, and a diverse rotation that would complement his main operation. Word of Jake's interest in my methods spread quickly through the farming community. If Jake Morrison, one of the most traditional and skeptical farmers in the township, was willing to experiment with new approaches, then maybe these methods deserved serious consideration. By spring, 3 other farmers had committed to trying similar experiments on portions of their land. Chapter 12. Expansion and Influence. My second growing season began with dramatically different circumstances than my first. Instead of working in isolation while neighbors watched skeptically, I found myself at the center of a growing movement toward more sustainable and profitable farming methods. The university research program that had documented my first year's success secured additional funding to study multiple farms implementing similar integrated approaches. Dr. Chen established a formal research partnership with my farm, using it as a demonstration site for visiting researchers and agricultural students. 5 local farmers, including Jake Morrison, implemented modified versions of my methods on test plots. I spent my spring consulting with them, sharing techniques, and helping them adapt the principles to their larger-scale operations and existing equipment. My own operation expanded thoughtfully. I added 10 acres through a lease agreement with a neighboring retired farmer, but I maintained the same intensive, diversified approach that had proven successful. Rather than simply scaling up, I deepened my specialization in the highest value crops and most innovative techniques. The heritage grains that had been such a breakthrough in my first year attracted attention from artisanal bread bakers and craft breweries across the region. I contracted to grow specific ancient varieties for customers who valued their unique flavors and nutritional properties. Restaurant relationships that had started with simple vegetable sales evolved into collaborative partnerships. Chefs worked with me to plan specialized crops for their specific menus, creating farm-to-table relationships that guaranteed premium prices and reduced my marketing costs. But the most satisfying development was the change in my relationship with the local farming community. The coffee sessions at Miller's Diner now included regular discussions of soil biology, integrated pest management, and sustainable profitability. I had become a respected voice in conversations about the future of agriculture. Young farmers from across the state began visiting to learn about my methods. Some stayed for weeks, working on my farm while developing their own plans for sustainable operations. "You've started something bigger than just your own farm," Dr. Chen told me during one of her research visits. "You've demonstrated that innovation and sustainability can coexist with profitability. That's changing how we think about agriculture." Chapter 13. Legacy of Change. 3 years after buying 40 acres in rural Iowa, I stood in my fields during harvest season, surrounded by abundance that exceeded my wildest dreams. But the real measure of success wasn't just my own farm's productivity. It was the transformation I could see across the entire region. Jake Morrison's experimental plot had been so successful that he converted an additional 200 acres to integrated management the following year. His yields per acre had actually increased, while his input costs decreased dramatically. "I can't believe I resisted this for so long," he told me. "Turns out you can teach an old farmer new tricks." The demonstration sites that Dr. Chen's research program had established across 3 counties were producing consistently impressive results. The university's agricultural extension service was now recommending modified versions of my techniques to farmers throughout the Midwest. A new generation of young farmers was moving to the area, attracted by the proven success of sustainable, profitable agriculture. The township that had once been skeptical of innovation was becoming known as a center for agricultural innovation. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the conversations at Miller's Diner. Discussions about farming now included topics that had been foreign just a few years earlier: soil microbiomes, beneficial insect habitats, carbon sequestration, and regenerative agriculture. The farmers who had once dismissed my methods as impractical were now debating the finer points of companion planting and cover crop selection. My own operation had evolved into something I never could have imagined when I first purchased those 40 acres. I was growing over 100 different varieties of crops, selling to customers across the region, and hosting educational programs for farmers, students, and researchers. The financial success continued to exceed projections. My revenue per acre had grown to over $5,000 annually, with profit margins that made my farming operation more lucrative than many businesses. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I was proving sustainable agriculture could feed people while healing the land. Standing in my fields that autumn evening, watching the sun set over a landscape that had been transformed, not just by my work, but by the collective efforts of a community embracing change, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. "You're not a real farmer," Jake Morrison had told me 3 years earlier. Those words had stung, but they had also motivated me to prove that farming isn't defined by tradition alone. It's defined by dedication, innovation, and results. I had started with 40 acres and a dream. I had harvested not just crops, but respect, community, and proof that sometimes the most powerful changes come from those who dare to do things differently. The harvest was complete, but the real growth was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this story of persistence, innovation, and proving that success comes in many forms. Please let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of people who refuse to give up on their dreams.